great honor for me to be able to introduce him tonight. To give you a sense of the inspiration that David Suzuki and his last tour across Canada gave us is the very last piece of legislation we introduced in the BC Legislature this last session was introducing an environmental Bill of Rights for the province of British Columbia based on the recommendations of the Blue Dot Tour. Now, we have put a lot of pieces of legislation in BC Green Party over the last 3 years. And I've received feedback on social media from a variety of them. This particular piece of legislation had nearly 70,000 British Columbians come and view it on our page. It generated 3,000 plus likes from British Columbians, and it was shared something like 1,000 times. It single-handedly was the most important and most interested piece of legislation that people have been interested in. And that we can thank David Suzuki and the Blue Dot Tour for the work they did in raising awareness. This will be a message that we will be campaigning on over the next few months, that we need an environmental commissioner in the province of British Columbia. We need to have oversight in environmental issues in British Columbia. We need to ensure that future generations have the same right to the quality of the environment that we inherited ourselves. And that, again, comes from the Blue Dot Tour, and we can thank David Suzuki for that. It is an enormous honor for me, again, to introduce David. Again, he needs no introduction, particularly in this audience. David, thank you so much for being here.
I've got one thing we really need to do, and that is to get rid of Christy Clark. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Sami's people and thank them for caring for this area for thousands of years. It's my honor, believe me, it is my honor to be asked to come here and have the opportunity to share a few of my ideas with you. So I thank you for giving me this chance. If you were going to try to assess the kind of issues that you feel are really important to Canadians by measuring the amount of space or time devoted to issues in radio, television, or newspapers, newspaper reporting, you would, I think, quickly conclude that business, that politics, that sports, and celebrity were by far the highest priority, our preoccupation. And of course, none of those is as important as science. Science when applied by industry, medicine, and the military. I was born in Vancouver in 1936. When I was a child growing up, I remember vividly resenting the fact my parents wouldn't let me go to movies or public swimming pools in the summer because they were terrified I might catch polio. Kids today have no idea what polio is. When I was a child, hundreds of thousands of people around the world died and millions were horribly scarred by smallpox. Hasn't been a case of smallpox for over 40 years. It's extinct. When I was a child, there were no transoceanic phone calls. There were no jet planes. There were no Xerox or birth control pills or computers or cell phones, and I could go on with a list that would go on for pages. All of that, these things have become a part of our daily lives since I was a child. And each innovation changes the way that we live, indeed changes the way we see ourselves in relation to the world. And yet, it is an area, the impact of science and technology is virtually ignored, except to celebrate how clever we are and how much money we can make from innovations that are coming in regularly. I began my career, the first television series I did was in 1962. And I went into television then because I believed that science was too important to be left to politicians or business people in how science was going to be applied. That in a democracy, we depend on an informed public to make wise decisions. And the best decisions can only be made with a maximum of good information. And that was my attempt then in television to provide accessible information about science, which Andrew knows very well. He's done it all of his academic career. It was, but to assess the information being provided, you have to have an audience that is scientifically literate, that takes science seriously. Today, the degree of illiteracy about science is indicated by the people that we elect to office. They're indicative of the quality or the abilities of the people that elect them. So if you think about it, every single one of the 16 candidates for leadership in the Republican Party is a climate denier, including Donald Trump. You think about it, how many people in the Liberal Party of British Columbia are climate deniers? Certainly, Mr. Harper, while he was Prime Minister, never even let the words climate change leave his lips. Tried to suppress the availability of information about climate to all Canadians. Have you ever heard Christy Clark seriously address the foremost issue of our time? She inherited an instrument, a very powerful instrument, from one of her predecessors, Gordon Campbell, the carbon tax. And all she has done with it is to brag about it, but hasn't done a thing to use that instrument in a way by increasing it. We all say, oh, well, it's so expensive. We never look to Sweden, which in 1992 imposed a carbon tax of $133 a ton. We started off with what, 10 and worked our way up to 30? Not only did they have $133 a ton, but in 2008, they increased it to 167 or something. During the period from 1992 to 2008, the Swedish economy grew by more than 40%. So all these people like Harper and Clark that are saying that a carbon tax is such a burden, it will destroy the economy, simply are lying to you because the evidence is very clear. British Columbia is in fact the canary in the coal mine for the rest of Canada. You know, coal miners used to take a canary down into the mines because canaries are very sensitive to hydrogen sulfide, which is toxic. So when the canary keeled over, they didn't say, hey, that bird just keeled over. Do you think that there's some hydrogen sulfide? They got their asses out of there as fast as they could. That's why they brought the canary down. If you ever flew over the northern forest of British Columbia 5 years ago and see that forest turn to bright red, and if you weren't scared shitless by that, to see what the mountain pine beetle was doing to British Columbia because winters weren't cold enough to keep them under control. Talk to any fisherman along the coast of British Columbia about how the oceans are changing. And it's not just the toxic blooms of plankton. They're talking about invasive species we're seeing here that don't belong here. We're talking about the temperature-sensitive sockeye runs. Sockeye are very, very sensitive to increases in temperature. And then you talk to people about the massive fires that we had in Kelowna. I was in Haida Gwaii last year. Haida Gwaii are the Misty Isles. It's always raining there. They had a drought. They had to ration water in Skidegate, the community I go to. And you all remember Vancouver. We always complain about the rain in Vancouver. We live in Vancouver because it's in the heart of a rainforest. And last year we had a severe drought. If these aren't indications to the rest of this country, we're at the forefront of the impact of climate change. And we ought to be at the forefront of leading the charge on acting in a serious way about it. Our premier went to Paris didn't she go to Paris? Went to Paris. She brags about supporting this historic agreement that was signed in Paris. And yet she has done nothing to seriously address the need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions. She simply hasn't put together a plan that makes any sense at all. She claims she cares about the environment. She wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet targets, and she is determined to consult with First Nations now. But as my dad always told me when I was a kid, you are what you do, not what you say. Just look at Christy Clark's track record and you know damn well that she is not the things I've just cited. So when Andrew asked me to speak, you can attest to this, I agreed immediately, because Greens are raising the issues that are of the greatest importance and the greatest challenges of our time. And we don't have a lot of time to respond to that. How ridiculous it is today for the media pundits to act as if, well, the Greens own the environment, so the other parties don't have to pay any attention. That's not their issue. In fact, and I've told Elizabeth this many times, there shouldn't be a Green Party, for God's sakes. The environment shouldn't be an issue that one party says, this is our major interest. It should be an issue for all parties, but we're not there.
Yeah.
The other parties may claim that they're the proponents of issues like hunger and poverty, like social justice, like economics. But as Pope Francis's magnificent document, Laudato Si, indicated, they are inseparable. And I as an environmentalist have tended to do that compartmentalization, you know. Oh, social justice, well that's Amnesty International. Hunger and poverty, oh that's Oxfam. Environmental, that's the David Suzuki Foundation. We act as if these issues don't have anything to do with each other. Now I'm an atheist, but I will kiss the Pope's hands, his feet, or any part of his body he wants for that document. It is a magnificent document. I've read it many times. He put it so clearly. You can't separate these issues. As environmentalists, social justice, hunger and poverty, these are our issues, because you can't talk about sustainability without addressing those issues. BC Greens, I believe, are unbelievably fortunate to have as your leader and MLA, Andrew Weaver, who is a scientist, thank God, a climatologist, a man who can cut through the garbage and state with clarity the real bottom line. And I thank you, Andrew. I can certainly tell you from personal experience, the transition from an academic career to a political career is not an easy path to take. It takes a tremendous amount of courage and commitment, and I congratulate you for doing that. And I believe the Green Party now occupies a position that the CCF-NDP once did. It was a party that put principle before the naked desire for power. The NDP has gone down a very different road since I was its supporter so many years ago. The role of the Greens is not to lust to find the political means of gaining power. It's to set the real bottom line, the standard to which it can call all of the other politicians and parties to pay attention to. For me, the environmental movement began personally in 1962. Now, I had spent 8 years in the United States getting my education in the most glorious period in the history of science. When I started my last year in college in 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. And I can tell you that was an amazing time, because when Sputnik went up, every hour and a half you could hear that beep beep of that satellite, and it was like thumbing your nose at the Americans. And the Americans just took the challenge, and they said, we got to beat these guys. And meanwhile, you know, every one of the American rockets blew up on the launch pad. And meanwhile, the Russians launched the first animal in space, a dog, Laika. The first man in space, Yuri Gagarin. The first team of cosmonauts. First spacewalk. The first woman, Valentina Tereshkova. And we realized, holy cow, they're really advanced. But Americans didn't shrink. They said, we got to beat these guys. We got to get to the moon. And in 1961, Kennedy said, we're going to get a crew to the moon and back safely within a decade. And they beat that target. Not only are they only a country to meet that target, but the amazing spin-offs that nobody anticipated. When they took the challenge of beating the Russians, Nobody knew how the hell they were going to do it. They were just beginning the whole kind of space rocketry. But the commitment was to get to the moon before the Russians. And not only were they the first and only country to do that, even 60 years later, when Nobel Prizes in sciences are announced, who still wins most of them? They're scientists in America. Because 60 years ago, Americans made that commitment. Every year, the United States, NASA, publishes a book called Spin-Off, which includes hundreds of spin-offs, from ear thermometers to space blankets to GPS to cell phones. The list is incredible, that have all spun off from the commitment to get to the moon first. And that's the way, when I go to the United States, I tell Americans, it's un-American to say we can't do anything about climate change, it's too expensive. That's not what Americans do. And I believe that's a challenge for Canada. The history tells us the important thing is to grasp the challenge and then say, this is what we have to do to try to meet that challenge. And I believe that agreement signed in Paris was it. That's the number, and that's what we've got to aim at, and that's what we have to gear all of our programs to meeting now. A temperature rise of no more than 1.5 or a little beyond 1.5 this century. I can tell you, it was a glorious time to be in the United States, because even here I was a Canadian studying in the States. All you had to do was say, I love science. They threw money at you. I got job offers, and I wasn't even applying for jobs. There were jobs everywhere. But in 1962, I decided I didn't want to live in the United States. I wanted to come home. Not because Canada was better, but it was different, and I valued that difference. I felt that Canadians weren't as obsessed with money as Americans are. Americans seem to put money as the highest measure of worth in society. I love the fact that there was a party, the CCF, which morphed into the NDP, that in America would be branded out-and-out commie, but it was a legitimate party. I love Tommy Douglas and Medicare. I love the equalization payments, where the poorer provinces get some of the riches from the well-off provinces. That to me was what Canada is all about. Canada to me meant Quebec. It meant the National Film Board and the CBC. And I've never regretted coming, until Harvard got it. I've never regretted coming home to Canada. I came back to Canada in 1962, and man, I was determined to make my reputation. I was a hotshot geneticist, and I was gonna make my and I got totally sidetracked by a woman. And, I know, it's happened to me all my life, and it's been disastrous, but in this case, I'm ever grateful to her, although my great regret is I never met her. In 1962, a woman named Rachel Carson published a book called Silent Spring. And as a hotshot scientist, it was like a slap in the head. Because as I read that book, I realized that powerful as science is, still there was so much we didn't know. We couldn't anticipate the impact of our powerful technologies. What Rachel Carson said is, you spray on fields at very low concentration, that DDT is consumed by microorganisms that are not killed, and they're eaten, and at each level up the food chain, you concentrate it. So by the time you get to the shell glands of birds or the breasts of women, you've concentrated DDT hundreds of thousands of times. How could we have anticipated and managed the use of DDT when we only discovered the phenomenon of biomagnification when eagles began to disappear and scientists tracked down the cause? And over the years, I realized that when America dropped nuclear bombs on Japan in 1945, we didn't know there was a thing called radioactive fallout. That was discovered when bombs were exploded over Bikini. When CFCs were used, nobody knew CFCs would drift high in the atmosphere, that ultraviolet light would cleave chlorine-free radicals off the CFC molecule, and chlorine breaks down ozone. I didn't even know there was an ozone layer up there when scientists began to say, hey, CFCs are breaking down the ozone layer. And now we are talking about genetically modified organisms and salmon that we're going to release in the oceans. We're talking about geoengineering in order to deal with climate change. We haven't seemed to have learned that however powerful science and technology are, we don't know enough to anticipate what the consequences there will be. So the other thing that Rachel Carson taught me was that everything in the world is connected. You spray chemicals onto a farmer's field to kill pests, and you end up affecting fish and birds and human beings. Because you can't escape, nothing is separate. Science can't encompass that. Science is more reductionist, where we look at parts of nature. And so, like millions of other people around the world, because of Rachel Carson, I was swept up in the environmental movement. And it was a very exciting time. When her book came out, there wasn't a single department of the environment in any government on the planet. It was Rachel Carson's book that put the environment on the agenda. And of course, because of that, we have environment departments and portfolios and committees at every level of government around the world. Because of Rachel Carson, we got laws to protect air and water and endangered species, and millions of hectares have been set aside as parks and reserves. And we celebrated a lot of successes here in British Columbia. There was a proposal by oil companies to drill for oil in Hecate Strait. And I joined with First Nations, with OSAN, and we fought that and we stopped that proposal. The Americans were proposing to bring oil supertankers from the North Slopes of Alaska through BC waters to be refined in Seattle. And thanks to David Anderson, who was the leader of the Liberals in BC, when being a Liberal meant being a Liberal, not a conservative, and he stopped it. There was a proposal to build a dam at Site C. I almost drowned protesting. I overturned a canoe up in the Peace River protesting that. And we stopped it. We stopped a dam to be built at Altamira in Brazil. And we celebrated these great victories. But as you all know, 35 years later, guess what? We're fighting the same bloody battles over again. What we thought were victories were not true victories. We didn't change the way people looked at themselves and our place in the world. We didn't shift the paradigm. And so we are going to end up fighting battles over and over again. And now the consequence of the enormous power of science and technology is that we are in what scientists refer to as the Anthropocene epoch, the period in evolutionary history of the planet when human beings have become the major factor altering the properties, physical, chemical, and biological, of the planet on a geological scale. We are now the dominant force of nature. When people talk about hurricanes or floods or droughts as natural disasters, they're not natural. When we talk about these as acts of God, unless we're gods, they're not acts of God. The human imprint is so big now that we are influencing what were once called natural disasters or acts of God. So we in the process of applying this enormous power to alter the physical, chemical, and biological properties of the planet, we are undermining the very things on Earth that keep us alive. So let me tell you a few of the lessons I've gained from my own personal experience. The first story I'd like to tell you, the Nature of Things decided back in the, I think it was the 1980s, to do a 2-hour special on forestry called Voices in the Forest. And I arranged with McMillan Blodell to film 3 loggers in a cut block on Vancouver Island near Ucluelet. So we drove up in our van, and as we got our cameras and tripods out, the loggers came out of the forest and they started yelling at me, "You goddamn environmentalists, you're threatening our jobs, and we're just honest workers." And it was great television. And we argued back and forth, and I gave as much as they took, as they gave me. And finally, at the end, I said, you know, I don't know any environmentalists that are against logging. Many of us love to work with wood. I worked as a construction, on construction for 8 years of my life. I love carpentry. But we want to be sure that your children and grandchildren will be able to log forests as rich as the ones you're cutting now. Right away, one of the loggers said, no way my kids are going to go into logging. There won't be any trees left. And that's when I realized, you know, we're talking about the long-term health of the forest. That's what we want to ensure continues on. They're talking about their paycheck from month to month. They've got to pay for their car and their mortgage on their house and keep food on the plate. So first lesson, be sure that when you're talking to someone or arguing with someone, you're arguing on the same plane. There's no point talking about apples and oranges, and that experience taught me that lesson. My second story, back in the 70s, 80s, the Lytton Indian Band called me and asked if I would support them in fighting a company that was going to log their sacred valley, the Stein Valley. BC government had given a logging permit to Fletcher Challenge, a New Zealand forest company, to log the valley. So I said, well, I'll try to do it, but before I commit to this, I'd like to see what I'm fighting for. Let me go camping in the valley. So I took my family and we went camping in the Stein for 5 days, and it's a magnificent valley, no question about it. And as we were coming out after 5 days, and all stinky and sweaty, and we came to the trailhead, and there was a party, a big party, and we knew they weren't campers because the women were in dresses and the men were in suits and ties. But you know, when you're on the trail, you immediately talk, and very quickly I realized, holy cow, one of these guys is the CEO of Fletcher Challenge. And very quickly he realized, holy cow, one of these guys, that shit disturber, David Suzuki. So needless to say, very quickly, the discussion escalated and we started shouting at each other. And finally he said, listen, Suzuki, are tree huggers like you willing to pay to protect those trees? Because if you're not willing to pay for them, they don't have any value until someone cuts them down. And that's when I realized, OMG, he's absolutely right. If we keep talking about the economics and the value of the forest, we're going to lose every time. Because he could tell me how many cubic meters of pulp there was there, how many board feet of lumber, how many jobs, how much profit. He could tell me all of that. And meanwhile, I'm going around, well, we could pick some berries, and we might cut some salal and put them in flower arrangements. Maybe we'll discover a cure for cancer. So the point is that the real reason we're fighting to protect that forest, not only is it of spiritual value for the people for whom that valley belongs, but all of the things the forest does for us, we're fighting for that forest because every green thing is taking carbon out of the air, putting oxygen back in it. Not a bad service for an animal like us. If they didn't do it, we wouldn't be here. But you know what economists call that? An externality. It's not in the economy. Those trees are pumping millions of gallons of water out of the soil, transpiring it into the air and modulating weather and climate. An externality. The trees are clinging to the soil, so when it rains, that soil doesn't wash into the spawning beds of the salmon. That's an externality. The forest is an ecosystem that supports countless other species of plants and animals. All of those things that intact forest does to keep the planet habitable for us are dismissed by economists as irrelevant. And that's when I realized as long as we continue to argue within the constraints imposed by economics, we're going to lose every time. That was my next lesson. Another lesson, or story. When Bill Bennett was fighting all of the forest wars that were breaking out in British Columbia all over the place, he punted by setting up round tables. So he said, let's set up round tables there, and we'll bring all of the stakeholders, I hate that word, but all of the stakeholders to the table and see if they can resolve it. Well, of course, what happened was you get the First Nations, you get the guide outfits, you get the loggers, you get the truckers, you get the enviros, you get the tourism operators. All of these people are around the table, and they're duking it out for their share of the forest. And nobody is fighting for the forest as an entity. And more recently, the government started a program called PNCEMA, Pacific North Coast Integrated Management Area, the area of the coast extending from the panhandle of Alaska all the way down to the middle of Vancouver Island. That whole area was going to be dealt with in terms of how we're going to deal with shipping and fishing and tourism and so on. And again, all of the stakeholders were there. I was asked to give the opening address. And I said, look, you all have various ways of seeing that area, but all of you depend on a strong, healthy ocean ecosystem. As long as that's healthy, you're all going to benefit. It's like the story of the goose that laid the golden egg. You know, treat the goose so it's happy, healthy, you'll get a golden egg every day. Get greedy and kill the goose, you get nothing. Well, I thought I was setting a bar and that people would go, yeah, we gotta protect. Right away, a fisherman came up and said, my family's been fishing on this coast for 4 generations. Don't tell me I'm gonna have to worry about the health of the oceans. I want to be sure to get my share. And this is, I think, the real important lesson. There's no point having these kinds of ways of trying to deal with the problem at the round table or PNCEMA if they don't all come together agreeing on something that is more important than their individual stakes. So my last story is that 4 years ago I got a call from Fort McMurray, and it was the CEO of one of the largest oil companies in the tar sands. And he said, would it be okay if I came down to have a discussion with you? I said, absolutely, I'm not into fighting, come down. He came to my door the next morning, and I said how happy I was and how honored and thrilled and thank you and all that stuff. And then I said, I just want you to do me one favor before you come into my office. Please leave your identity as a CEO of an oil company outside. I want to meet you man to man, human being to human being. Because Mr. CEO, I said, I don't want to fight. I want us first to agree on what is the basic bottom line. What do all human beings agree are the foundation of the way we live? He was immediately unhappy. And he very reluctantly came into my office. And I said, look, I know this is an awkward thing. You came down for other reasons, but let me present my case to you. I said that this planet, our home, is created, is shaped and constrained by laws of nature. And there's nothing we can do. Those are laws of nature. You can't change those. We live within them. I said physics tells us that we can't build a rocket that will go faster than the speed of light. We know that. Einstein told us that. And everybody lives within that except science fiction writers. But we understand there will never be a rocket that will travel faster than the speed of light. We know you can't, the law of gravity says you can't build an anti-gravity machine here on Earth. And the first and second laws of thermodynamics dictate that we cannot build a perpetual motion machine. Everybody understands that. Nobody tries to say we can do better than that. We live within that. And in chemistry, it's the same. The atomic properties of the elements, the diffusion constants and the reaction rates, all of that we understand dictates the kinds of atoms that we can put together in a test tube and the kinds of molecules we can synthesize. That's dictated by laws of chemistry. And in biology, it's the same. Every species that lives within an ecosystem or a habitat, that ecosystem, every species has a maximum number it can achieve in that habitat or ecosystem, dictated by the carrying capacity, of the ecosystem. Exceed that maximum number and your population will fall. Well, humans aren't confined to ecosystems or habitats. We're so smart, we can live within many, many different environments, from deserts to tundra to the Arctic to wetlands and tropical rainforests. We're a very adaptive ability. But we still are confined to the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. That's our home. And there are limits. The carrying capacity for humans is dictated by the number of humans and the amount of consumption per person. And every scientist I've talked to agrees we're already way past the carrying capacity of the planet for our species. And this is what I'm talking to this CEO about. I said, and Mr. CEO, we are all animals. And you know, I was in Austin, Texas, giving a speech to a group of green builders way back in the 1990s. There was a big audience with a lot of kids who were all sitting in the front. And I said, now kids, if there's one thing you remember from my speech, remember we are animals. Did their parents get pissed off at me? Don't you call my daughter an animal, we're human beings. I was really shocked. I said, look, if you're not an animal, are you a plant? Because biology dictates you are animals. And so I said to the CEO, I said, what do you think is the most important thing every human being on earth needs? And I could see he's thinking money, a job, a company, profit. I said, if you don't have air for 3 to 4 minutes, you're dead. We are walking such a narrow line between life and death. If you have to breathe constantly contaminated air, you're sick. So surely you would agree, every human being's highest priority is clean air. That must be at the top of the agenda for what we appreciate and protect. And then I said, you and I are 60 to 70% water. We're basically a big blob of water with enough thickener added so we don't dribble away on the floor. But of course the body leaks water, right? It comes out of our eyes and our mouth and our nose and our crotch and we skin and we lose. If you don't have water for 4 to 6 days, you're dead. If you have to drink polluted water, you're sick. So surely clean water is up there with clean air as the highest priority for any group of humans. And then I said, well, food is different, but you and I could last between 4 and 6 weeks without food, but we would die. And most of that food is grown in the earth. And if you have to eat contaminated food, you're sick. So can we not put clean soil and food up with clean air, clean water? And then I said, every bit of the energy in your body and mind that we need to move and grow and reproduce, all of that energy is sunlight. Sunlight captured by plants in photosynthesis, converted into chemical energy, then we get it by eating the plants or the animals that eat the plants, and we store that energy in our bodies. And when we need it, we burn it. And we liberate the energy of the sun back out into our bodies. So photosynthesis should be up there. I said, I would like you to shake hands with me and agree that those 4 things which indigenous people around the world refer to as the 4 sacred elements, earth, air, fire, and water. I want you, Mr. CEO, to shake my hand and say, yes, that's got to be the highest priority of all people on earth, of all societies, and we will then, when we shake hands and agree, work to ensure that and then find out how we can live and have an economy. And I said, one final thing. The miracle to me of life on earth, that we need these 4 sacred elements, is that those 4 sacred elements are cleansed, are replenished, are created by the web of life itself. In the greatest gift, the rest of creation, our relatives, create the soil that we grow our food in. Every bit of our food that we eat for our nourishment was once alive. They create our bodies. You all have read or seen the movie The Martian, where Matt Damon gets stranded on Mars and he's got to stretch his potatoes from 1 year to 4 years. Lots of dust and clay and gravel and sand. There's no soil. To do that, he's got to shit in every hole and put a piece of potato and grow it. So it's life that creates the very soil on which we depend. All of the energy comes from plants in the oceans and on land that we need for our bodies. And the air is created. Again, before there was any photosynthesis, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. Oxygen is a very reactive element. Liberate oxygen, it immediately oxidizes or rusts things and disappears. Plants created the oxygen-rich atmosphere that we depend on and continue to create that to this day. And let's see, that's earth, air, and Vancouver gets all of its water from 3 watersheds surrounded by old-growth rainforest. When it rains, the tree roots and plant roots and soil fungi and bacteria filter that water. You don't have to do anything except just drink it, which is the way I remember Canada when I was a kid. We'd drink out of any river or lake without even thinking about it. Nature performs all of these services that give us the 4 sacred elements. So I said, Mr. CEO, I believe this is the foundation of the way we have to live. Protecting clean air, clean water, clean soil, clean energy, and biodiversity. And if you will shake hands with me on that, I will work with every bit of energy I've got to help you and your company. And of course, the unfortunate thing is that he wouldn't shake hands with me. He left, he wasn't angry, he was just very sad. I never heard from him again. I heard he either resigned or retired a year later. I don't know, I'm sure it had nothing to do with me. It was very unfair because I had asked him to discuss issues that were not a part of his job as the CEO of a company. His job is to make money for his shareholders. And for him to come back and say, well, I had to talk with Suzuki and I have to agree, we can't do anything that will pollute the air, water, or soil. He'd get fired so fast because that's not his job. So I think the challenge is very great. I believe the corporate agenda is an anti-human agenda because it's based on the notion of growth forever, which is the creed of cancer cells. You can't have in a finite world growth forever. This is just crazy. And we have to find a way then of all coming together and agreeing on what the true bottom line is, and then we can work together to try to find a different way of getting out of the mess that we're in. And I look to the Greens as playing a very big role in that whole thing. Thank you very much.
Hurrah!